And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm your host, Andy Thayer with GLN, and we're very pleased to have tonight Scout Bratt of Jewish Voice for Peace. And Scout, thank you so much. You gave such an impassioned speech at this year's Slut Walk. A number of us in GLN said to each other, we've got to get Scout on our program. So thank you for making the time tonight on this snowy evening.
It's an honor. It's an honor. Thank you so much.
Now, Scout, for those who don't know, has been very active in Jewish Voice for Peace, which is I'll let you do the description, but you have been out front in terms of defending Palestinians against the racism that they face in Israel, as well as opposing U.S. aid to Israel. Tell us a little bit about Jewish Voice for Peace, please.
Sure, right on. Thank you. And we're honored to be here. Me on behalf of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a national organization that has chapters throughout the country focusing on a Jewish perspective and frame for Palestinian solidarity, aiming to support the liberation of Palestinians and justice and equality for all humans. So Jewish Voice for Peace in various cities across the U.S. will work in various areas like arts and culture, addressing the ways in which Jewish culture and Jewish arts can be an expression for justice and solidarity with Palestinians. We work in the realm of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, specifically in support of the Palestinian call to end support for Israel in the face of the occupation. We work in the realm of Jewish community transformation, trying to support communities of Jews who are organizing for justice and are not supporting Zionist state and Zionist occupation, because we understand and believe that Judaism and Zionism are not synonymous, and that it's really important to disentangle those two ideas so that we can support as Jews Palestinian liberation without the oppression through Zionism.
Well, and I think that's an incredibly important point, because Christianity, as we know, coming to the New World here, was very oppressive in terms of its expressions of colonialism, the wholesale murder of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans. But anyone who says that Christianity is just that is being really unfair, and is being totally ahistorical, because for any number of crimes that have been committed in the name of Christianity, there have been also great freedom fighters who have resisted. I mean, any number of black freedom fighters fighting against slavery, for example, consider themselves devout Christians, as well as people of other religions who were engaged in that fight. So to cast Judaism as being equal to Zionism, the colonial control of Palestinians, the theft of their lands and so forth, I think that's a really important point, and it's so valuable to have Jewish Voice for Peace speaking to the liberatory aspects of Judaism. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that before we go more into the show.
Absolutely. About how Jewish Voice for Peace is a specifically Jewish organization. Yeah, I think one really important point you mentioned, which is being historically accurate, is that Zionism is relatively new in terms of the larger and longer Jewish history of peoplehood and culture. And so when we think about the establishment of the State of Israel, and in particular the United States' reliance on Zionism as a core component of Jewish practice and Jewish life, Jewish Voice for Peace is really trying in many ways to challenge that. I know growing up as a young person in Kansas City, I was in a very active Jewish community, went to a Jewish day school, and Zionism as a value set and as a framework was absolutely woven throughout all of my education. And what Jewish Voice for Peace is saying is that Jewish values of justice and equity and equality are actually antithetical to Zionism and the occupation that is practiced in the name of Zionism. So Jewish Voice for Peace is cultivating Jewish communities and Jewish programs that actually challenge the ways in which we address Judaism as synonymous with Zionism.
Yeah, and you can check out Jewish Voice for Peace at their website there, jewishvoiceforpeace.org, and we'll be getting that up a little bit later in the show. I'd like to shift gears, though, a little bit now and talk a little bit about the situation in Israel, It has been referred to as an apartheid state. And for those of you who are too young to have been politically aware at the time, apartheid was a term that was used in reference to the white racist government of South Africa. And this is a map of South Africa showing the areas that were controlled by the whites in yellow and by blacks who were, I don't remember the specific figures, but it was upwards of at least 75, maybe 80%. Don't quote me on that, but it was an overwhelming majority of people in South Africa were either of Indian descent, of mixed white and black descent, or black descent. They all considered themselves in the anti-apartheid movement to be black. That was the term that he embraced. And you see here, in spite of being the overwhelming majority of the population in apartheid South Africa, the majority of the population controlled just tiny bits in purple there on the map. You fast forward to today, and you look at what has happened to the dispossession of Palestinians since Israeli independence. You see just a couple years before independence in 1946, where the green area was that which was controlled by Palestinians, and then over the ensuing decades, the thefts of land, the wars of Israel have now led it to that point where you see on the right side there, those are the small areas of Palestine that are controlled by Palestinians, and they are approaching 50% of the population, and yet they have the worst land. And just a side-by-side comparison here, the situation of apartheid in South Africa in terms of what people controlled and what people didn't control looks very, very similar to Israel today. And this has got real impacts on people's lives. But I mean, just remember, if you look at a map of the United States, what happened to Native Americans, it looks very similar to that kind of sweep of theft of land to the point where Native Americans control only tiny bits of the worst land. And it's not even to show a map that says, well, you know, Palestinians control this part. It's like what the Native Americans got in this country. It was the absolute worst land. It was a desert and so forth.
And I think what's really remarkable about these maps and the transition from years to years of land is also the separation of those little chunks of land, which increasingly with occupation, it is a strategy to divide Palestinian communities from each other. And so the passing back and forth from owned land by Palestinian land is incredibly hard through checkpoints, through false constructions of barriers that are done without warning and done without ending, and really restricts people's ability to move throughout the land that was once definitely theirs, and they still have the right to claim and be in, according to Jewish Voice for Peace and anti-occupation activists.
Well, and any number of South African anti-apartheid activists themselves have said that Israel is an apartheid state. Reverend Desmond Tutu, who's probably, aside from the late Nelson Mandela, the foremost leader of the anti-apartheid struggle, had this to say. He said, "I have witnessed the systemic humiliation of Palestinian men, women, and children by the Israeli security forces. Their humiliation is familiar to all black South Africans who were corralled and insulted and assaulted by the security forces of the apartheid government." And so even the former President Jimmy Carter labeled Israel an apartheid state. That is the level of racism, and anyone who's familiar with the Israeli press would recognize that. We don't hear about that here in the United States. We have actually a very much more shall we say, pinkwash, and we'll get into that term a little bit later, view of what Israeli apartheid is. But I read a statistics recently, I believe it was 48% of Israeli Jews favored quote-unquote transfer. Now, for those not familiar with this term, that's a polite term for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from that entire map that you saw earlier on your screen there. And that is the level of racism that permeates. I'd like to just move on a little bit because this forceful separation of people doesn't come without violence. It doesn't come without force of various kinds, and you'll see that in the pictures we're going to get up on your screen here. And Scout, please feel free to add your thoughts about this. This here is the so-called apartheid wall. No, this is not on the U.S.-Mexico border, though maybe coming soon.
Yeah, and we know that the ties between Trump and Netanyahu are strong enough to encourage that statement that you said, and it's possible truth.
Well, and going back to the South African analogy, Israel was a big supporter of the apartheid government, sold it arms, even when the apartheid government was an international pariah. The Israeli government sold arms not just to the racist South African government, but to any number of dictators that had been banned to receive arms by Congress here, such as the Guatemalan dictatorship, which was responsible for tens of thousands of murders of its own people.
Which I think when you're bringing in the global, I'll say, examples of these practices of brutal policing and racist discrimination and restriction of movement, that's something that Jewish Voice for Peace has been highlighting through specifically the Deadly Exchanges campaign, which looks at the exchanges between Israeli police and U.S. police, FBI agents, Homeland Security agents, ICE agents, exchanging practices of mass surveillance, of profiling, racist profiling, or racial profiling, of silencing dissenters through lethal policing and unnecessarily violent police tactics, crowd dispersal tactics, that we know that the U.S. often sees the Israeli government and the Israeli police as experts in, and so they sponsor trainings through organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which is a self-described civil rights organization. It's facilitating exchanges of worst practices that help maintain these, I'll say, restrictions of movement and occupation that we've seen not just here in the United States, but also in Palestine.
Well, and we've seen any number of exchanges between the Chicago Police Department and Israeli security agencies. In fact, the CPD has been, of local police forces, amongst the most prominent in those kind of exchanges. And certainly the CPD hasn't shown any great record of friendliness towards people of color. And before I go any farther, that telephone number on the bottom of your screen, if you want to ask Scout a brief question or make a brief comment, please call that number at the bottom of your screen, 312-738-1060. I'd like to just show a little bit about what this means in practice in terms of the policing that you just spoke about, Scout. These are some pictures from, I believe this is the West Bank here, literally taking in children. I'll get a statistic up on your screen here in a few moments, but just these pictures, I think, speak volumes about the violence of the occupation, that people are not going to just sit back idly and allow this to happen to them. And even very young kids will get involved in they see what's happening to their parents, the humiliations, the thefts of their land and so forth. And these are some of the things that happen. This is, probably for black youth in here in Chicago, unfortunately, in many respects, reminiscent.
And Jewish Voice for Peace specifically has developed a campaign called No Way to Treat a Child that addresses how yearly 700 Palestinian children are arrested and prosecuted by the Israeli military, and that Israel is the only country in the world that lacks basic safeguards against arresting and detaining and prosecuting young people.
And in here we see the statistic up on your screen right now. They arrest up to 700 Palestinian children a year, and up to 94% are held in pre-trial detention without bail. it is incredibly common for Palestinian activists of all ages to be held without charges, let alone trials, for years. And so this is the kind of violence that the separation that we spoke about incurs. We do have a caller. Caller, you're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment, please?
Yes, I'm just very interested in what's going on and your analogy of, or using the word apartheid, because I'm actually from Africa. And I know one of the reasons that South Africa finally got independence was because of the riots, like the Soweto riots. And I mean, there's deaths with riots, but unfortunately sometimes that's what has to happen to obtain freedom. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that can be done as far as Palestine avoiding death or riots to be seen as an independent state?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, ideally, yes, right? Palestinian activists and fight for liberation has been lasting for a long time, for many years, since the outset of, I'll say, the Zionist quest for independence in the state of Israel before 1948. And I think what we're seeing is that the strength of the Israeli military and the support that even the United States gives the Israeli military ensures that lethal policing and brutal practices are the common practice, are commonplace. And so undue, unnecessary physical violence and repression of protesters is a common practice that both the U.S. police and agents for the border here in the United States and even ICE agents in general are gathering from the practices that the Israeli military and the Israeli police forces have been honing over the course of the entire occupation.
And these sort of human rights violations have been routinely documented by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and any number of other bodies. Part of the whole dispossession of Palestinians takes, we got to understand this is a near desert country, and here living next to the biggest bodies of fresh water in the world, we take water for granted, but in most areas of the world, but especially in places like the Middle East, water is a very critical component in terms of determining who is on what side of that apartheid equation. And here's just coming up on your screen here, just some information about that. The per capita water consumption of Israeli Jews is 287 liters per day versus you see the figures for Palestinians ranging between 20 and 79 liters per day. This has got real health consequences. The water table in much of the area, for example, of Gaza has been horribly polluted because of the repeated bombardments of the territory, basically the blockade of critical components to purify water, to have electricity so those water purification plants, sewage treatment plants can run. And so we've got a huge environmental disaster in Gaza. But that's only just part of it, as I'll show here in just a minute here. The bombardments of various invasions and attacks by Israel, particularly in Gaza, have been extremely devastating. Here is one from, I believe this was from 2016. You show a modern military jet bombing what is quite clearly a densely populated area. This is going to kill people. This is going to kill any number of people, and it has. I don't have any statistics at my fingertips about that, but I think the pictures tell a thousand words about this kind of devastation. You can't bomb a dense urban area like this without killing scores of civilians. And you look at those buildings in the foreground of these pictures here, you can see that this is just one of many bombardments that has taken place. And the United States plays a big role in this.
So yeah, what we're showing and what we're saying is that the restriction of human life and the dehumanization of Palestinians both in the West Bank and in Gaza and also in East Jerusalem comes not just through military force, through the dehumanization specifically of young people, but also through the lack of basic life support like water. So it's not the violence that we think of only through military force, but it's through like an institutionalized systemic practice of divesting from Palestinian communities.
hmm And the United States, as I mentioned, plays a critical role in this. I mean, we are by far the biggest arms exporter in the world, and a huge proportion of those arms go to Israel, despite its relatively small population in comparison to other countries. And that figure of arms exports to Israel, I mean, is horrible as Donald Trump is. He's just the latest iteration of that. Barack Obama led record arms sales and aid to Israel, and Donald Trump has promised more of that.
All done, right, in the name of this partnership and in the name of, I'll say, washing Israel as a democracy. The only democracy in the Middle East is how we picture, how we talk about, how we promote Israel, which really ties into what I think we'll speak about in a minute, which is this brand Israel, the way we think about and talk about Israel in media from the United States and in Israel, portrays Israel as a haven for safety, of security, and for also gay liberation as well. So when we think about the partnership between Israel and the United States, not just through police exchanges or through arms trades, but also financial support and media support, it has very long-lasting, widespread impacts on the way the individual person may respond to the apartheid or even understand the situation as being an apartheid.
Well, and we use the term pinkwashing, and this is, as our regular viewers knows, this is an LGBTQ program here. What is the connection? There has been a steadfast program and policy of the Israeli government and various non-governmental organizations that receive aid and funding from the government to promote the idea that Israel is a haven for LGBTs, and therefore we should ignore or excuse the oppression of Palestinians. Never mind the fact that many Palestinians themselves are LGBTQ.
Right.
This has been a very concerted campaign. We saw it at the January 2016 NGLTEF Creating Change Conference here in Chicago. We see it with organizations such as the Center on Halsted hosting a wider bridge, which is an Israeli-funded by the Israeli government and partnering with the Israeli embassy or organization to both basically promote a soft image. And this was very similar to what apartheid South Africa tried to do in many respects. So we're the civilized nation on the African continent, that kind of nonsense.
And I think the juxtaposition is don't you see that Israel is the gay-friendly, the queer-inclusive space, and Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, they are backwards, they are antiquated, they are not accepting of gay people, not accepting of lesbians or trans people, when we know that that is a strategic painting of Palestinians to, again, dehumanize Palestinian identities, Palestinian communities and values, and uphold Israel as a beacon of justice and democracy and an acceptance in order to, like you said, wash over the human rights abuses and the atrocities of the occupation, a literal like bait and switch that is not only done in Israel, but is absolutely a primary, I will say, component of the attempt to paint Israel as an ally for more liberal or progressive people who, if they learned about the details of the water crisis, of detaining and prosecuting young people and children, of the restrictions on movement, would be outraged, would stand up against the Israeli occupation that its existence depends upon.
Yeah, and just a footnote to that, which shouldn't even be a footnote, is that it's not just the fact that people are being imprisoned and so forth. It's literal torture has been documented, systemic torture against Palestinians by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch over and over and over again. And this is Israel's not just one nation amongst many. Why are we picking on Israel and so forth? The fact is that Israel has long been the biggest recipient of U.S. aid, far out of proportion to its size. The number one recipient of aid surrounding most of Gaza and the West Bank. Egypt, which surrounds Gaza a bit to the south, is the number two, and that's no accident. That so we here in the United States have got direct culpability for this kind of oppression that you've seen on your screen tonight, unless we do actually actively speak out against it. The United States is very much involved in this and has used Israel as a very convenient tool. As I mentioned earlier, when, for example, the U.S.-supported dictatorship in Guatemala, when public pressure forced the cutoff of aid to it, when public pressure forced the cutoff of aid to South Africa, Israel stepped right in and started supplying those governments with that kind of aid. Unfortunately, we're getting towards the end of our show. Just want to make a quick few announcements here. We're very pleased that Scout and others will be joining us at a special forum coming up in the second Saturday in December. We're calling it Stop Pinkwashing Israeli Apartheid. Hopefully people understand what we mean by the term pinkwashing now, and apartheid, for those of you who are too young to remember what that meant in South Africa. That's going to be 2 p.m. Saturday, December 9th at the Uptown branch of the Chicago Public Library. Please check that out. You can go for more information as it comes available at our website at the bottom of the screen there. And also, of course, check out Jewish Voice for Peace. Great organization, has been a leading, playing a leading role in the fight for justice for Palestinians, well, as along with, of course, Palestinians themselves. So with that, this is Andy Thayer with Scout Bratt. Thank you for watching tonight, and we'll see you next month.